Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Um, in this video, I am going to be talking about the time change. So, this upcoming time change and kind of in general the fall time change and what makes it specific. I'll be giving kind of my four main tips that I usually, whenever I'm working with clients, things that I do to help adjust their little one during the time change, things that I'm doing right now with my own kids. So I'll kind of use them as an example. And kind of going about this in terms of making very small gradual changes the week prior to the time change and then even the week following the time change. So small gradual things you can do to adjust your little one, and the four main things that I do and have done with clients. So this year's time change in the fall, so it will be on October 31st this year, so over Halloween night. And what will happen is on Halloween night, so after you go to sleep, October 31st, the clocks will move back 1 hour. So when you wake up on November 1st, so for example, we wake up every day around 6:30. So on November 1st, when you wake up, it will now be 5:30. So the clocks fall back 1 hour. And if your normal time 6:30, you'll be waking up at 5:30. So there'll be a new time on the clock. So normally, kind of the week up to this time change, the big things that I work on with clients and my own kids is trying to shift their whole schedule forward. Because if you can move it forward, when the time changes back, we're more aligned with what their normal schedule is. And a lot of people who contact me will say, I get a lot of emails saying, my child's already waking up too early. I can't afford an even earlier wake up. Or some people just want to be able to shift them and have them adjusted to this new schedule. So the big thing that we'll talk about right now is how you can work on kind of shifting their whole schedule forward so that when it falls back, they can be better adjusted. And this will be kind of the week leading into the time change and the week after. And I'll give some examples of what that will look like too. So before I give tips, I want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about kind of infant toddler brain and how it works to time sleep. Because one thing we're going to talk about a lot is the timing of sleep and shifting that time. So I think by understanding how their little brain works, it will help to understand the tips that I give. So I just want to take kind of a quick moment to talk about that first. So I've shown this similar image to this before. So this is a little one's brain, kind of any brain, and there's this really tiny cluster of neurons here. So it's right in the middle of the brain. It's right kind of located above the brainstem, and it's a really small cluster of neurons. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or call it the SCN for short. And this is a really kind of like a more primitive structure. It's been around, evolutionary speaking or phylogenetically speaking, one of the longest or oldest structures, I guess, in the brain. Every animal, every mammal, bird, reptile, even, a teeny tiny fruit fly has this little cluster of neurons that does the same thing in every animal in the world. So it's a really old structure. It's a really powerful, tiny little cluster of neurons. And what it does is it has direct connections to the eye. So, and specifically to the retina of the eye. It's called the retinal tract. And what it does is when sun kind of hits the eye and the retina, it has these direct connections to it. And when sun hits the eye, it triggers it, and to kind of wake up the whole brain. And there's a whole cascade of effects that work to wake up the brain. So things like the frontal lobe, it'll wake up so that your attention's ready, your problem solving abilities are ready, and you're more alert. Things like your mood, so it might boost serotonin and different neurotransmitters that affect your mood. It will help trigger your body to wake up, so things like digestion, your temperature, cortisol, all of different hormones, neurotransmitters get increased when light hits your eye in the morning, and so it really kind of wakes up your whole brain. And what's interesting is when you say for us, we wake up around 6:30 every day. If your little one wakes up at 6:30 day after day after day, this area kind of becomes this internal timekeeping mechanism that gets stuck in a pattern of waking up every day around that same time. So that's kind of what I meant by it's really powerful, and it can get your body into this specific rhythm of waking up around the same time every day. So little ones will really get accustomed to waking up around the same time each day, due to day after day, the sunlight kind of hitting their eyes. So it's kind of thought of as a timekeeping mechanism, and it kind of works that way. And also, when it's dark at night, so in the absence of light, it also has this whole cascade of effects on their brain that help put them to sleep. So it increases melatonin, different neurotransmitters for sleep, and it puts the whole brain and the body in a state of being ready for sleep. So if it's dark around the same time each night, day after day after day, the body really gets used to this timekeeping, this internal mechanism of being tired around the same time each day. So it can be really helpful for sleep, because if they wake up around the same time each day and go to bed around the same time, their bodies can get really efficient. So when things are consistent, this works the more optimally. But what can happen with a lot of clients I've worked with is, say they're waking up too early, or say we have a time change and all of a sudden they're getting up at 5:30 or too early. It can be hard to shift this. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about today, is shifting this internal clock so that they can get up a little later and stay up a little later. And the body will adjust to this shift, but there's some things you can do to help it along. So it is a powerful structure, but it's also one that you can change. And one thing we will talk a little bit about is using light and dark cues to help shift this internal clock, and get it in the place that you want it to be. And you don't want it too early. So that's what we'll talk about, and ways that you can kind of shift it around. And one way we'll be using light and dark cues. So I have 4 main things to think about when working to shift their clocks. And again, the idea is we want everything to be a little bit later. So we want their naps to be a little bit later, their bedtime to be a little later, their sleep in to be a little later. So again, in 1 week from today, when the clocks move back, they're adjusted a little bit and they're not getting up. For us, it would be 5:30 a.m. So that's our goal, and that's what we're going to talk about. How do we get them shifted? This can also be after the time change. So if you don't have the time to do it leading up, I do recommend trying your best to, but you can also keep shifting them after the time change too. So these tips can really be applied to now, to the week after. They can also be used if you go through a time change or like a time zone change. You can use it to shift their little clocks too. When we moved from Ontario to Calgary, my son, he was waking up at 7 o'clock in Ontario, which was 5 a.m. in Calgary. So I used these same tips to move him to 7 o'clock in Calgary, so 2 hours forward. So it can be any kind of time change when they're waking up just way too early for you. And you can kind of, apply these tips to that too. Okay, so the first thing that I recommend. So again, we're shifting them forward. We want naps to be a little bit later, bedtime to be a little bit later. One of the big things when I'm helping people do this is trying to shift them in a way that they're not going to get too overexhausted, and trying to keep them as rested as possible. Because what can happen is, say you decide, okay, I'm going to try their nap to be, say, 20 minutes later than usual, so I can shift that clock. If they're overexhausted, overtired, and if that shift causes them to be, it can really backfire on parents, because what happens is when babies, toddlers are overtired, they actually fight sleep more. Their sleep is shorter, and a lot of times it causes more night wake ups or an earlier wake up. So sometimes it can backfire if you push them too much. The sleep will be worse, and then it's really not going to help you shift everything, because you want them to be able to sleep longer so you can shift them a little bit later again. So one of the big things we always do is try to get them as much sleep as they can. Sleep right now is our friend because what happens if they have, say, a really good nap, then you're going to be a little bit more comfortable putting them to bed and shifting them, say, 15, 20 minutes later in their bedtime. They'll be less likely to fight sleep, and it will just go better. So one thing I recommend is just trying to give them as many opportunities to have a good nap as you can. So things like, if you know that they nap really well when they're at home at a certain time, try to give them that nap that you know will be a good nap. Try to avoid things like, if you know, oh, they had a short nap in the car today, so they're just tired. If you know that's not going to be the best nap, try not to do that. So we always try to create the best opportunities for sleep so that we're comfortable pushing them forward, and that it doesn't backfire on us and cause more disrupted sleep. So anything you can do to just keep them rested during this time, again, will give you more of a chance to say, okay, they had a really good nap. Now I can maybe make bedtime a little bit later, or I can make the next nap a little bit later. And it just gives you more of a chance to push them out of that comfort zone, again, without having it backfire. It could also be things like just changing, if you know something helps their sleep, do it. So it could be, darkening the room. It could be adding, white noise. If your dog's loud and might wake them up, it could mean, telling your other child to be quiet so they can sleep. Whatever you think can help them get the best sleep, just try to do that. So again, they're not getting overexhausted and you can push them forward. It also could be possibly thinking about, like, a lot of clients, they'll say, on Wednesdays they're at daycare and they don't nap great, but they're home on Thursdays. So sometimes it means starting initially with the change on a day that was a good day for them. So a lot of times I'll ask about, what does their week look like? When do they nap well? A lot of people will say on Fridays they're just really exhausted from a week of daycare. So Friday's probably not the best night to push their bedtime later. So we'll often think about a good day and try to work around what we know is good, or help create a good day for them. And if you can, some people can't, and we just kind of have to go with it. But if you can kind of think about that and help get them started on a day they're not exhausted, that's always going to lead to better results. One thing is, if you have a newborn, or even like a 3 to 4 month old, I found this age the easiest in terms of shifting their clock forward and keeping them up later for bedtime, because what I would do at this age is just add in another nap in the day. Like, if your child's young enough, there's no consistent pattern to their schedule, it's easier to add in maybe an extra nap and then do bedtime a little later. So kind of newborns, I find easier in that sense. Once they're, on a more consistent, say they're napping 3 times a day, 2 times a day, 1 time a day, I wouldn't recommend adding in another nap and making bedtime later, because you want to keep their schedule the same, just shifted forward. But if it's a younger child, you could. Some clients will say, oh, sometimes they nap twice a day, sometimes once a day. They're kind of in that in-between stage. And so in that case, we might say, okay, let's shift them forward on a day they nap twice a day. Or if they say sometimes they nap once, sometimes they don't nap at all. Okay, on the day they do nap, let's shift it forward. So that can be kind of an exception, but otherwise I would suggest keeping the schedule, but just trying to make the naps good naps so that you can move it forward. And it's kind of a fine line between, again, pushing their bedtime or their nap a little later and not getting them overexhausted, and working on that by just trying to get the best sleep possible for them when you can. So that's tip number 1. Keep them well rested while you're doing it, or it will backfire. And if you notice that you push bedtime too late and sleep was not good that night, I would suggest maybe trying to scale it back a little and just keep working on things. Okay, so tip number 2. I always recommend doing the increments, so how much you're pushing their maybe nap forward or their bedtime forward. Try to do it in smaller increments. So for example, this week, I think this is the second day, I've been moving everything just 15 minutes. So my daughter's naps around 15 minutes later than usual. Then bedtime 15 minutes later, and then hopefully she'll sleep in 15 minutes. So I'm doing smaller pushes forward, again, as a way not to make her completely exhausted. And it helps with that internal timekeeping, because what will happen is if I pushed her a whole hour, she's still going to wake up probably around the same time. But the 15 minutes, I find they're more likely to make that sleep up, and it doesn't disrupt their sleep. So that's one way you can do it. And then what I will do kind of the 4 days. So for the next couple days, I'll do 15 minutes and then I'll add 15 more. So then it'll be shifted 15 minutes, everything forward, 15 more minutes. So by the time we get to the time change, it'll be 30 minutes total, 15 now and then 15 closer to the date. And everyone will be 30 minutes later than usual. And then what I will do after the time change is continue doing that. So another 15 minutes. So I kind of usually work on half the hour before the time change, half hour. So I split the difference and just know it'll take some time and patience and they'll get there. Some families, it might depend on the child. So your child might be able to be pushed 20, 30 minutes later and sleep in and be fine. And it really depends on the child. The kids and infants I work with usually aren't that great at sleep, so smaller increments works better. But, it could depend on the child. And especially older kids, like my son's 5, and he can be, pushed more. Like he's not as sensitive to being sleep deprived. When you have say you have a 6-month-old, pushing them 30 minutes is quite a lot for them to add on before they have a nap. So it can depend on the age too. Usually younger babies, you want smaller increments because they just can't handle being pushed that much and it'll disrupt sleep more. So that's one thing you can think about is splitting it up and not feeling like you should do the whole hour at once. And it also can depend on your schedule. So some kids kind of have to try to adjust quicker because they're in a certain routine at daycare. So it all depends, but you certainly can split it into smaller increments. And I think starting early and thinking about it the week before is the best way to do that, because it gives you some time to start working on it. And by no means are we strict on that 15-minute mark, but it is something I just constantly think about, and I try to push them a little bit later. And it's hard when you're really busy. You're not going to be perfect at the timing, but if you keep it in the back of your mind that you're going to be working on this over the next week or two, then it'll help kind of give those opportunities to push them. But yeah, tip number 2 is try to shift them in more gradual increments. And over maybe a little bit longer period if you can. Number 3, okay, so say we start moving them forward. So for example, my daughter, she's napping like around 15 minutes later. Her bedtime will be 15 minutes later. And then the goal is you want them to sleep in that extra 15 minutes in the morning. Because if you're pushing them forward at night and they're still waking up around the same time, it's kind of pointless because they're just losing more sleep and their clock's not shifting forward in the morning. So what we usually do as we're working on the daytime changes, in the morning, we really want to start pushing that clock, that like when the sun wakes your brain up and all of that, we want to start pushing that the same amount forward too. So for her, she usually wakes up at 6:30. I want her now waking up at 6:45. So I want to start shifting that little internal clock that pops awake later. So that is something that we work on too, is not only the bedtime in the night, but we want the morning to follow with it, or it's just, again, pointless. Ideally, you want them to sleep in and take that extra sleep in the morning. But if they don't, the one thing I work on a lot is trying to at least wait that extra time. So for her, it'd be 6:45. Try to wait before, turning the lights on, getting their day started, and start getting her little brain used to it being like dark time until that 6:45. And what happens is day after day, if you do that and you start shifting the light cues and dark cues, if it can stay dark until 6:45, their brain will start picking that up, and that will be their new time. Their body's used to getting up, having the lights on, and starting their day. So a lot of families, what I'll suggest is, maybe if they're okay in their bed and they're up and just kind of making noise, you could keep them in the dark until 6:45. Some families might go in and just kind of hold and sit with them and wait, and then say, okay, now it's time to get up. And over time, their body will get used to that being dark time and light time. Because remember, this little SCN cluster is very powerful. It will start picking up that and shifting. So that's one thing you want to think about in the morning, trying to either have them sleep later, ideally. Sometimes we'll say, try to be quiet, maybe black out the room if you think there's something outside that might wake them up, birds singing or the sun rising. It could be having white noise. So for us, I've been putting fans on just to block out noise because my husband gets up around 6:30 for work. So if you think something might wake them up in the environment, try to block that out. Just try to give them that opportunity to get that extra sleep. If you have a toddler, one thing I always recommend is a grow clock, which you can set. And I've readjusted Lila's for 6:45 in the morning. And then that will help them stay in bed until the sun comes up. And I have a video on grow clocks, which I really recommend for toddlers. So that's another thing you can use. But yeah, again, you want to kind of keep their dark until that time you're hoping they sleep in until. And then for Lila, what we'll do, again, another 15 minutes closer to the time change, and then I'll keep it dark until 7 o'clock. So I'll keep adding some time and getting her little body used to being night and day. So tip number 3, create darkness if you can until you want that little clock to turn on and until the time you're hoping to shift it forward. Because again, a lot of parents will push nighttime sleep or push bedtime, but then they're still up at the same time and they start getting overexhausted. So you want to shift that and hopefully have them sleep in a little bit later and add that sleep on to the morning if they can. And then last tip, so as well as keeping it dark when you want the new time to be dark, we want to use sunlight to our advantage during the day to help their little bodies get used to sunlight. And specifically more like in the early afternoon, what you can do is start getting them sunlight exposure in like early afternoon or later afternoon. And what that will do is just help the little clocks kind of almost like stay awake, stay alert, and you can use it to help shift the bedtime later. So I always recommend, like, you could do kind of like even a before dinner walk. If there's still sunlight, you could, anything you can do to kind of get them out exposed to light. Sometimes if Lila had a good nap, sometimes I'll take her for a little walk in the stroller, either after dinner or before dinner, and get her that sunlight exposure in the day, and that will help her little clock remember that it's daytime, and then you can do kind of your dark cues when your new bedtime is, and kind of help shift them that way. Their bodies really do respond to light and dark, so using those while you're shifting things around is really advantageous for them. And sometimes with clients, say we know, okay, we want bedtime to be 15-20 minutes later than usual. One thing we'll do is maybe like a stroller walk, so they're getting that sunlight exposure, but they're not being super physically active, that they're going to be overexhausted. So stroller walks are nice because they can just sit and kind of relax, so you're not overextending them before bedtime, but they still get that sunlight exposure. So sometimes we think about the amount of physical activity they're doing. If we're pushing their schedule forward, we probably don't want to overexhaust them by doing, and a lot of parents will think, oh, let's like get them exhausted. Let's like have them run, which can work sometimes. But if you have a child, the ones I work with at least, it usually backfires and doesn't work. So it's kind of finding that balance between how much physical activity is going to overexhaust them, and but giving them that sunlight exposure. So if you feel like, oh, they're a little grumpy or tired, maybe just like an easier walk might help you reach that bedtime point, but it won't get them so that it just like makes it harder for them to fall asleep and disrupts their night. So that's something I've been doing a little bit with Lila, is just some outdoor time, and so her little clock will shift and adjust. But yeah, it's really kind of a balance of figuring out how to kind of fill their tank but not overexhaust them, and every baby is different, kind of depending on their age and what they can handle. And one thing to keep in mind is, I know a lot of families are probably very busy right now. We have a lot on our plate, a lot is going on, and don't feel like you have to do this perfectly. It takes time, it takes patience, and you won't be able to do everything all at once. My goal is more to give you these tips so that they're there with you, but you can use them as you need, or maybe you might find an opportunity one day. For me, it's all about taking the opportunities, and I'll notice, oh, Lila had a good nap. Okay, maybe I'll have her bedtime a little later. And I think just if this information is kind of with you, you might be able to just kind of gradually work on it when you can. I know, a lot of families have a lot going on. So if you can kind of just keep it in the back of your mind and gradually work on it, they will get there. Their bodies will adjust. It just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of patience, and a little bit of just kind of paying attention to it and trying to keep them rested. And this year, the time change is on a Saturday night on Halloween. And a lot of parents are scared of it because they're like, oh, like there's already all the candy and so much going on. They're going to be exhausted. This is the worst time for a time change. But I actually think Halloween night on a Saturday is the best time it can be, because they'll be out. If you're going trick-or-treating, they'll be out anyway. They'll probably be up later than you want them to, or, than they can handle. And then Sunday is the best opportunity for them to sleep in. If Halloween was a Sunday night and they had to get up for like daycare or preschool, then I'd say that's not the best time, because you're keeping them up late and they're getting up early and there's the time change. But to me, a Saturday night is perfect because you can keep them up that little bit later, hopefully help them just sleep in as best they can, recover them on Sunday, get them some good rest, and keep working on that shift. So I think this year is actually the most optimal time to do the time change. And to me, yeah, the problem more is if Halloween's like the night before the time change, because then you have a time change and then they're up late for Halloween. But to me, if you can work on these steps leading up to Saturday night, it'll put them in a good spot to hopefully have a little bit of a later night, have a sleep in. But I think doing that work and those shifts prior is probably the key, because you don't want them to go into Halloween night already exhausted, because it might backfire. So my best advice is keep them rested as much as you can this week. Start working on gradually shifting them. Use light and dark to give their body those cues, and then Halloween night should fall on an okay night for the time change. So it doesn't have to be as scary as it seems to be. But yeah, I hope that helps. If you liked this video, if it's helpful, give me a thumbs up, give me a comment. I make these videos. I have no idea if they're helping people, if people are watching. On my end, if I get one comment that it helped, it makes me do more. So as much as you can let me know, it just gives me an incentive to keep making them. So be sure to like and let me know. You can follow along if you want to subscribe. I think there's a little bell, you can be notified. I do live Q&As once a week, so that's a space that you can ask me questions and talk to me directly. So that's always something that you can do. And yeah, so that's all I've got. As always, just remember, be patient, and hopefully in 20 years you won't remember this video, but my goal is that information will seep into your brain and you'll use it as you need when you can. And yeah, so I hope everyone has a safe and happy Halloween and stay rested. And that's all I've got. So bye, guys.